Thanks so much, Robbie. And thank you all for being here today. So I think many of you may have seen our previous presentation about the overall findings of the 2021 statewide assessment of problem gambling in Illinois. In today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on findings specifically about certain vulnerable and marginalized populations in the state and putting them in the context of what we know from other research in these populations. To begin, I just want to acknowledge that the statewide assessment was conducted by our organization, Health Resources in Action, in partnership with the Division of Substance Use Prevention and Recovery, SUPER, at the Illinois Department of Human Services, and funding came from the Casino Gaming Tax Fund. I also want to acknowledge the large research team that worked on this assessment at HRIA. So as Robbie said, I'm Hannah Carliner and I led the study, and I'm here today with my colleague, Natalia Reynoso. So for today's session, we have a few learning objectives. First, to explain the importance of identifying vulnerable or marginalized groups who may be at higher risk for developing a gambling problem. Two, compare the prevalence of problem gambling in different racial and ethnic groups in Illinois. Three, describe the risk for problem gambling among Illinoisans of different ages. And four, describe differences in perceptions and attitudes about gambling and treatment seeking in different demographic groups. So just briefly, the 2021 Illinois Gambling Assessment consisted of a few different methodologies. So it was two surveys. One was an online or phone survey of the whole state population to get at the prevalence of various behaviors and the disorder at the state level. This was in English and Spanish. There was also an online and phone survey of frequent gamblers, and this was available in English, Spanish, and Chinese. We also conducted interviews with treatment providers, industry representatives, and advocates, as well as small group discussions with youth, people with problem gambling, and family members. So to put the study in context, as you all know, I'm sure there has been significant growth in commercial gambling in Illinois in recent years. In fiscal year 2019, annual tax revenues to the state from gambling totaled over $1.4 billion. And expansion in Illinois over the past 10 years has created many opportunities for gambling. At the time of the assessment, there were 10 casinos, but you all know that is expanding rapidly, and 36,000 video gaming terminals, but that has also grown. On the other hand, gambling also has its costs, and it's critical to understand how this expansion is affecting the population. The National Council on Problem Gambling estimates that $7 billion are spent annually in the US related to the social costs of problem gambling. And these include costs related to job loss, criminal justice involvement, and healthcare expenditures. So next slide, please. Why do we focus on vulnerable and marginalized populations? So first, one of the main goals of the assessment was to determine the prevalence of gambling and problem gambling, specifically in vulnerable populations or those marginalized due to race, culture, or socioeconomic disparities. So who are we talking about? As just noted, marginalized populations include people who are forced to the margins of our society because of structural and systemic discrimination due to things like racism, classism, gender identity, age, national origin, etc. Vulnerable populations are groups with characteristics that put them at higher risk for negative outcomes, in this case, for developing a gambling disorder. And this may be due to personal factors like sensation seeking or risk taking, loneliness, stress, past trauma, or worldview. But these factors are often shaped by an individual's place or identity in society. For example, young people tend to engage in more high-risk behaviors, or Black people tend to experience more stress in their lives because of the racism they experience every day in our society. And this shows up in the research. Studies show that there is a higher prevalence of problem gambling among Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian communities. And this could be an adaptive, unhealthy coping strategy to deal with the stress of lifelong racial discrimination, the stress of adapting to a new society as an immigrant, in combination with specific cultural norms, as well as in combination with targeted marketing by the gambling industry. So in this session, we're going to present some findings about gambling and problem gambling in groups defined by race, ethnicity, and age. These are some of the groups that showed the most notable differences in our study in Illinois, and they also allow us to talk about factors related to other vulnerabilities like income, education, and targeted or even predatory marketing. We also want to acknowledge that there are other identities and experiences that may make people discriminated against, marginalized, or vulnerable to developing a gambling problem. For example, related to gender, veteran status, sexual orientation, et cetera. We are not covering those in today's discussion, but this is a start. Additionally, this presentation mostly discusses singular identities and does not address the intersection of identities experienced by a specific individual. So this concept of intersectionality refers to the experiences of real people. So I am not only white in this moment or any other moment in my life. I'm always experiencing and reacting to the world based on the intersection of all of my identities. So being white, being a woman, being of a certain age, being a daughter, a sister. And so while we, from an analytical perspective, sort of highlight into singular identities, we acknowledge that this is only a first step and that we as researchers and you all as clinicians have to also consider intersectionality of identities within the communities that we work with. So with that, I will pass it over to my colleague, Natalia Reynoso, to tell you some of our findings from the statewide assessment of gambling.
Great, thanks, Hannah. So like we talked about, race ethnicity is a critical lens to really consider when thinking about who's impacted the most by gambling and problem gambling. So I'll highlight what our findings can tell us about Illinois and how that fits into the bigger picture, and then we'll do some deep dives into particular communities. So to remind you all, one of our main goals in this assessment was to determine how many Illinoisans gamble and what are the forms that they're gambling with. So overall, we found that 90% of adult Illinoisans had ever gambled in their lives, and 68% reported gambling in the past year. So in this table, we have the lifetime prevalence of gambling by race ethnicity, excluding lottery, since that was the top form of gambling for all groups. But there were still some interesting findings that emerged. So starting with Asian Illinoisans, the first column in that chart. So the top three forms of gambling were casinos, gambling with friends or in the community. So that category included things like bingo, raffles, card games with friends, and office pools. And then lastly, other forms of gambling, which in our survey included things like high-risk trading of stocks and virtual currencies, or any other form of gambling that respondents felt didn't align with the options that were given to them. Next, Black Illinoisans had a similar prevalence, with the third most popular form being gambling, video gambling. So those first two were the same as Asian Illinoisans. And then in the third column, for Hispanic Latinx Illinoisans, the top two forms of gambling were the reverse of that of Asian and Black Illinoisans. That video gambling was similarly the third most popular form of gambling. White Illinoisans had the largest group that reported gambling in their lifetime at 73%. Gambling with friends in the community and casinos are similarly popular, with racetrack being a unique popular form of gambling in third place, with 40.8% of white Illinoisans reporting that they had ever gambled on racetracks in their life. So Illinoisans of another race ethnicity had the same three forms of gambling as Black Illinoisans, with more Illinoisans of other race ethnicities reporting that they engaged in video gambling. So sort of given the overall similarities in these types of gambling, you might be wondering, does this extend to problem gambling, or are there some other differences that we should be considering? So statewide, the prevalence of problem gambling in Illinois was 3.8%, with 7.7% at risk for developing a gambling problem. But when we look at this prevalence by race ethnicity, some groups are lower and higher than these estimates. So this graph shows racial ethnic differences and the proportion of different gambler types in the representative population sample. So the different colors represent never gamblers, non-frequent gamblers, and so on, with people with problem gambling shown in orange and those at risk shown in lime green. So for the first bar at 68.6%, Asian Illinoisans were the most likely to report that they were non-frequent gamblers or gambled less than once per month, which is shown in that light blue. The next bar for Black Illinoisans had the highest proportion of non or never gamblers at 18.9%, shown in dark blue on the second bar. Next, for Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans, shown in the third bar, they had the highest prevalence of problem gambling across the different racial ethnic groups at 7.3%, with an additional 8.1% being at risk for developing a gambling problem. Next, for white Illinoisans, the fourth bar, they had the smallest prevalence of problem gambling at 2.9%, which is under that overall state prevalence. And then Illinoisans of another race ethnicity fell slightly above that at 4.1%. So in order to dive deeper into these race ethnicity findings, we looked at only frequent gamblers. So, or people that gambled at least once per month from our representative sample. So as I just said, there are three types of frequent gamblers: recreational gamblers, those at risk for problem gambling, and then those with a current gambling problem. And this graph shows the distribution of these gambler types within Illinoisans of different races and ethnicities. So you can see in this graph, the orange color again represents people with problem gambling. Light green again represents those at risk, and dark green represents recreational gamblers. So if we take a look of the results among Black Illinoisans in the top, nearly 12% of frequent Black African-American gamblers have a gambling problem. For Hispanic Illinoisans in the next bar, you can see that this prevalence is more than twice of that of Black Illinoisans at 26% nearly. White Illinoisans have a prevalence just above 10%. So these differences in prevalence of problem gambling really aren't innate. They're connected to those structural factors that Hannah mentioned earlier, such as targeted marketing, low income, and racial discrimination that some of these groups face on a daily basis. So we'll discuss these a little more in depth in the coming slides, but we can draw some preliminary conclusions based on these overview. So one, white Illinoisans are more likely to gamble than other races and ethnicities, but are less likely to have a gambling problem. Hispanic Illinoisans are most likely to not gamble at all, but if they do, they appear more likely to develop a gambling problem. And third, Hispanics appear to have almost twice the prevalence of gambling problems among frequent gamblers compared to racial ethnic groups, indicating that there's a real great need for outreach and services within the diverse Hispanic and Latinx communities in the state. The differences by race ethnicity also exist when it comes to seeking treatment for these problems. So again, we'll be diving into some of these groups more in depth soon, but here are some overviews of the differences and similarities in treatment seeking. So specifically, we looked at where Illinoisans would hypothetically seek advice for a gambling problem, for themselves or for somebody else. So overall, spouses, partners, and friends and family were the most popular sources of support that they reported that they would seek out. The graph shows these findings by race ethnicity, with the dark blue representing statewide results, dark green Asians, lime green Blacks and African Americans, orange Hispanic and Latinx, white, medium blue, and then other race ethnicity in that light blue color. So for spouses and partners, the results were pretty similar across the groups, with slightly more white Illinoisans saying they would seek support from a spouse or partner. Results varied a little bit more when it came to friends and family members, with nearly half of Illinoisans of another race ethnicity being the most likely to say that they would seek support from them. And in contrast, Asian Illinoisans were the least likely to say that they would seek advice from a friend or family member. So these differences also don't exist by coincidence and are really shaped by those social, cultural, and environmental factors. And we'll be providing some of that context that might be shaping these findings. But we'll be moving into our first poll question first.
Okay, I'm here. I apologize. Okay, the first poll question asks, which racial ethnic group was the least likely to gamble, but the most likely to develop a problem if they do gamble? Is it A, Asian Illinoisans? Is it B, Black African American Illinoisans? Is it C, Hispanic Latinx Illinoisans? Or is it D, white Illinoisans? Which were the most likely to develop a problem if they do gamble? The answers are coming in. We're about at 75%. T minus 15 seconds I'll give you guys. And then we'll launch the answers. Let's see here. I think that's everybody. And here are the results. Do you see the results, Natalia, Hannah?
I don't think so, but it looks.
I'm sorry. Yeah, let's see here. Let me see.
Did everyone respond?
Yeah, I think everyone responded. I think so. Well, we have 85% participated, and I get it mixed up if the 20, if we're part of the 20, but 18% answered A, Asian Illinoisans, B, 12% answered B, Black African American Illinoisans. But the largest percentage, I'm happy to say, got it correct, with 53% answering Hispanic Latinx Illinoisans, and then 18% answered D. Thank you, Adrian. Adrian, I think they just, okay.
And that is right. Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans was the right answer to this. Natalia, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, is it showing up?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so these are the data points that we talked about, so you can reference back to this. So 13.4% of Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans don't gamble, but we found that prevalence was 7.3%, which was nearly double the statewide prevalence of 3.8%. So we want to just pause here really quickly to hear any reactions or questions based on sort of the first set of slides that we've talked about. We know that as many of you are treatment providers, this might be something that resonates with you, or maybe you have some experiences that could kind of speak to this.
Yes, group, feel free to chat any questions or comments on what we've covered so far, as Natalia just asked, in regards to, I find it very interesting what the poll question, in fact, when I saw the poll questions with the answers, Hannah, Natalia, I found that very interesting and very important information in Illinois. You know, Victor Ortiz from Massachusetts, you guys probably know Victor, he's great. We had him speak pretty recently here in Illinois on gambling and outreach and preventative services and strategy in the Latinx community in Massachusetts, but he spoke on Illinois. So that's what came to my mind when I saw that. So, but anyways, we do want to open this up to a group chat. We are in webinar mode, so I'm unable to mute you folks. But if you have any questions, any comments on what Natalia has covered so far, this great information, please feel free to do so. Okay, we've got one from Joseph Harper. Stating, when you look at gambling behavior, do you look at forms of gambling outside of casino gambling, like sports ticket, lottery tickets? Good point, good question. I was thinking that too, Natalia, as you were showing some of the information, what some of the preferred gambling venues or types of gambling, perhaps the Latinx, Hispanic population look to, for instance. Or did any of your studies cover that, or do you have any thoughts towards that, either one of you?
Yeah, so I can start us off. So the study actually asked folks about various types of gambling. So we included things like lottery, casino gambling, sports betting, gambling with friends in the community, online gambling, and a couple other categories. So we really took a look at gambling more broadly, since we know some people might not necessarily consider certain behaviors gambling, like raffles, for example.
And we will get more into that. We have some more specific results that we're going to show you in a few slides from now.
Perfect. Wonderful. And Natalia, do you see there's another chat that came through here,
Yeah.
or a couple?
Yeah, I think I see Vanessa's
Okay.
comment about just finding that interesting fact about Latinx folks being more likely to gamble, less likely to gamble, but more likely to develop a problem. Yeah, so that's interesting that you've also sort of noticed that in your own life, in your own community. And we'll definitely be talking more about that. Great. So to stay sort of on track time-wise, I'm going to pass it to Hannah to sort of discuss some of the specific findings, starting with Asian Illinoisans.
Thanks. Yeah, so now we're going to take a closer look at some of the perceptions and attitudes about gambling, and also the outreach and treatment implications among certain racial and ethnic groups, starting with our findings about Asian Illinoisans. So first, we need to address the basic definition of gambling as perceived in different populations. So there's been research conducted in China describing how historically social gambling and high stakes gambling were perceived as different activities. So high stakes is seen as immoral, where generalization, but whereas social gaming is seen as an acceptable form of socializing. So this may result in Chinese Americans and possibly other Asian Americans failing to identify excessive or problematic social wagering as a form of problem gambling. And this was really reflected in conversations we had with treatment providers serving the Chinese communities in Illinois. They described, for example, how many older women were playing mahjong every day with their friends, which involves betting. And these women did not consider what they were doing to be gambling, and therefore failed to acknowledge the money they were losing and the debt they were getting into. And this was compounded by the stigma and shame that's associated with high stakes gambling in this and many other cultures, leading to a lack of acknowledgement of problem behaviors and a lack of seeking help. So this mismatch between more social forms of gambling and the stigma associated with high stakes gambling is also reflected in our survey results. As you can see in the graph on this slide, among Asian Illinoisans who took our survey, over 70% reported that they believed gambling is dangerous for family life, that gambling is a harmful form of entertainment, and that people who gamble too much cannot be trusted. Over 50% said they thought gambling is morally wrong, and over 1/4 said they would be embarrassed if a family member needed help with a gambling problem. So this vulnerability created by gambling as an important social behavior is also used by the gambling, may be used by the gambling industry. We have a quote here from a service provider talking about Chinese communities saying the shuttles to the casinos from Chinatown go around 24 hours a day. So people can work late at night and then go to the casino. They come back home on the shuttle and go back to work. So this quote illustrates that casinos really may be targeting Chinese communities in Illinois, though there are few prevention and treatment efforts tailored to these communities currently. So as treatment providers, I think the take home here is that one, you should be careful in the language that you use, since asking someone if they gamble may not get an accurate response in terms of what you consider to be gambling. And two, that families need to be engaged in outreach and treatment with the knowledge that stigma and denial may be at play. Next slide, thanks. Some other findings from our survey that could assist you in treating Asian American clients or patients were that Asian Illinoisans were the racial ethnic group most likely to say a reason they gambled was to escape from problems or distract themselves, which may be a precursor to disordered gambling. Asian Illinoisans were the least likely to report that they would seek help from a friend or family member for problem gambling, which could relate to the stigma and shame that I just mentioned. However, they were the group most likely to say that they would seek help from the internet. So outreach campaigns to bring in Asian Americans for treatment may want to start with education and awareness campaigns online. We also want to bring up considerations of racial equity. The category of Asian American includes people from dozens of different countries and ethnic groups, with variation in generation of immigration, acculturation, and experiences of discrimination. So much of what we've discussed here is focused on the Chinese American population of Illinois, but we want to note that in the overall Illinois population, 35% of people who identify as Asian are of Indian descent compared to 18% of Chinese descent. So as treatment providers, we urge you to use the findings to benefit those who you work with, but not use them to make generalizations, especially about the diversity of Asian Americans in the state. And then we are on to our next poll question.
I got you. Sure. Let me, okay, make sure this is the right, oh, yeah, it is. Okay. Poll question number 2 asks, which of the following was not an attitude or belief that was commonly held by a majority of Asian Illinoisans surveyed, which I found interesting as well. Is it A, there are few treatment and prevention efforts, I believe, let me make sure, tailored towards Asian communities? Is it B, gambling is good for the economy? Is it C, people who gamble too much cannot be trusted? Or is it D, gambling is dangerous for family life? Which of the following was not an attitude or belief that was commonly held by held by a majority of Asian Illinoisans that were surveyed? Is it A, there are few treatment and prevention efforts tailored towards Asian communities? B, gambling is good for the economy? Is it C, people who gamble too much cannot be trusted? Or is it D, gambling is dangerous for family life? Okay, we've got 75%, 15 of the 20. I'll give you guys, we'll do 10 more seconds. And then I will watch Wendell Brown. The answer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share results. Okay, Hannah, so we had 31% answered A, 44%, yay, answered the right answer. B, gambling is good for the economy. 13% people who gamble too much cannot be trusted. And then 13% answered D, gambling is dangerous for family life. So I'll stop sharing and get this off screen.
Thanks. And that was a tough one, but right, most of the attitudes that the Asian Illinoisans in our survey answered were more negative about gambling. And so the thing they did not say was gambling is good for the economy. Again, I think we want to open up for questions if anyone wants to chime in on any of their own experiences as treatment providers or community members. Please feel free to enter it in the chat.
Hannah, this is, of course, Robbie again. I've been thinking about this since I saw this last night when you guys sent me this poll question. Can you, do you have any thoughts towards the negativity that was portrayed, from what we just saw in the poll question?
I think it's related to people thinking of very intense forms of gambling is what they think of when they hear gambling. So it's this, it's this sort of stereotypical casinos betting thousands of dollars kind of thing. And a disordered maybe stereotype associated with that. They don't think of grandma playing mahjong every afternoon with her friends as gambling. And so, this is a guess. I would love to hear what people, attendees at this webinar think. But I think it's sort of this polarization of what is gambling and that real gambling is bad.
Sure. Yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts? Please chat your answers or comments here about specifically. I just found it interesting with the overall Asian community, and thank you for breaking down the Asian community as well, because it's just a large umbrella, right, with different communities involved. And we talk about gambling and the economy from an unbiased view when we conduct our 30-hour gambling course here. I do that, and I make sure that I do that in an unbiased light, if you will, because there's a lot of skin in the game, if you will, and I believe it is good for the economy. Where the money goes is another question, right? But I just found this very interesting. Does anyone have any comments about what's been covered in the overall webinar so far, but maybe even specifically what we're speaking on now, as it
And if
pertains to?
not, we can move on to, we're
Okay.
getting organic and
Sure.
Great. So thank you everyone for responding to that full question. So another racial group that we wanted to highlight was Black and African Americans in Illinois. So overall, in contrast, they actually held positive views overall of gambling compared to the state. And you can see this in the graph on the right, where we asked Illinoisans whether they agreed or disagreed with some different attitudes. So the bars in dark blue are statewide results, and the lime green bars represent the results among Black Illinoisans. So roughly 60% of Black and African American Illinoisans agreed or strongly agreed that gambling is good for the economy and that casinos are a good place to socialize. We also asked what were their motives for gambling, and similar to other races and ethnicities, the top motive for gambling was excitement or as a challenge at 68.1%. So this is also aligned with some previous research that was done in Massachusetts and Michigan that echoed that gambling was seen as a form of recreation and opportunity for excitement for Black and African Americans. But one finding that stands out in particular when thinking about risk was that the motive to win money for paying bills was endorsed by half of Black Illinoisans. So this is a really important finding to contextualize historically, because it isn't just that gambling is seen as a way for getting easy money specifically among this community, but it really has to connect with the ways that Black and African Americans have endured and continue to endure discrimination and structural racism that has really limited their opportunities for economic success. So when someone has been excluded from developing wealth in a traditional way, it makes sense why they might want to seek out alternative ways to sort of lessen that financial strain out of sort of the traditional ways that people typically make a living and make ends meet. So in a different study of gambling in Black African Americans in Massachusetts, this structural connection to problem gambling was summarized best by a quote from a community member that said, "We've always been the invisible population, services, money, everything gets chucked right past us." So the overall prevalence of problem gambling among Black Illinoisans was just shy of the state prevalence of 3.8%, but an additional 9% are at risk for developing a gambling problem. So these estimates fall on the lower end compared to national prevalence estimates, placing gambling prevalence at 8.3% for this group. In New Jersey, these numbers were slightly higher for those at risk for developing a problem. So there's really a range in terms, depending on the study and the population that they surveyed. So as with Asian Illinoisans, we also looked at the help sources that would be most frequently sought out by Black Illinoisans. So as shown in the graph on the right, while overall findings indicate that family, friends, and partners and spouses were the most popular sources of support one would seek out, this is not the case for Black Illinoisans. Black Illinoisans were the most likely to say that they would seek support from a peer support group such as Gamblers Anonymous, with half of respondents indicating this. The helpline was the second most popular source of support, followed by city or county health services at 21.4%. So knowing that Black Illinoisans would seek out these services further builds the argument for why it's really necessary to make these peer support groups and government-run services culturally appropriate and to really meet the unique needs of Black Illinoisans. So bringing up family, friends, or partners as the first step might backfire and might not necessarily work for certain individuals. And so the last ethnic group that we wanted to also lift up was Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans, given that high prevalence of problem gambling relative to the proportion of the state population. So in terms of perceptions, Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans largely agreed that gambling posed a significant harm to families and others. So the graph on the right shows these attitudes towards gambling, those that agreed or strongly agreed. And so you can see that the dark blue again is the statewide result, and then Hispanic and Latinx results are in that orange color. So nearly 70% of Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans agree that gambling is dangerous for family life. An additional 60% agree that people who gamble too much lack willpower, and that people that gamble too much can't be trusted. So while 95% of Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans recognize that gambling can become an addiction, there's still a lot of stigma associated with gambling and potentially having a gambling problem. So similar to the other groups we talked about, we asked Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans what were their motives for gambling. And similar to the other groups, the number one reason was for excitement or as a challenge. So kind of along those lines of recreation and for fun. So similar to Black and African American Illinoisans, though, the motive to win money for paying bills was once again the second top motive. So this partially may be related to similar forms of discrimination and exclusion that Hispanics and Latinx face economically, especially when we think about subgroups within that community, such as undocumented individuals or those with low levels of education or low income. So gambling can be a way to sort of make ends meet when the cards are stacked against you. But an additional factor that was highlighted in Oregon when talking about problem gambling in their Latinx community was that gambling establishments such as casinos and how they treated them well was a particular factor that drew them in. So one Oregon addiction counselor said, "Why do you think that the Latinos are so hooked up in the casino? Because they treat them good, they make them feel good." So what does this really mean for treatment? So as we mentioned earlier, the prevalence of problem gambling among Hispanic and Latinxes was 7.3%, which was nearly double that of the overall state, with an additional 8.1% at risk. So when we compare these numbers to national prevalence estimates, they fall slightly higher than a study from 2015, which is frequently cited for racial ethnic differences in problem gambling. However, in New Jersey, these numbers ranged from 16.2% to 30.6%, which are on the higher end and somewhat closer to the findings that we found among frequent Hispanic gamblers, which the prevalence was at 26%. So there's definitely some evidence highlighting that there's a great need for support within the Hispanic and Latinx communities, but we also want to recognize that we're talking about a really big demographic category. So it's important to consider the diversity within these communities. So estimates from the last Census American Community Survey shows that the country of origin for Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans in the state, so the majority of which are Mexican, followed by Puerto Rican, Guatemalan, and so on, which you can see in that graph. So gambling is likely perceived very differently even within these ethnic groups. So it's important to consider that cultural context and even language around gambling. So for example, some communities might use the Spanish word apostar to refer to gambling, while some others might refer to gambling as juegos de azar. And so it's really important to be conscientious about what language you're using. And so, as with other groups, we talked to Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans. If they did need support, where would they seek it? The top form of support that they would seek was internet search, which was just under 50%, followed by Gamblers Anonymous or other peer support groups at 41.8%. And then friends and family members at 36.4%. Encouragingly, though, among all racial and ethnic groups, Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans were the most likely to say that they would seek help from a mental health professional, meaning it's really critical to ensure that these resources are accessible to the great diversity within this community, including culture, language, and more. So I'm going to take a pause there and pass it on to Hannah.
Thank you, Natalia. So now we're going to pivot to discuss some of the findings of the assessment related to age group. We're a bit short on time, so I might rush through this a bit. By age, this gets to the question asked by Joseph earlier. In all age groups, lottery was the most prevalent form of gambling in the past year. And something else that stood out was that sports betting was most popular with Illinoisans under the age of 45. But now we want to zoom in more on what we think are sort of maybe more vulnerable populations. And this is young adults and older adults. So young adults age 18 to 24, the most popular forms of gambling that they had ever done in that group was lottery followed by gambling with friends or in the community, online gambling, sports and fight betting, and casinos. For older adults, it was quite a different pattern. Again, lottery was first, but then followed by casino, gambling with friends, racetrack, with almost 40% of older adults saying they had ever bet at racetracks in their lives, and then finally video gambling. So focusing in on gambling in older adults, there was a similar prevalence in a national study to adults overall, with estimates ranging from 0.2 to 12.9%. However, subsets of older adults may be at higher risk, for example, due to low income with no sort of opportunities for increasing their income for the rest of their lives, limited social support, and comorbid health problems. So for some older adults, gambling is one of the few opportunities for excitement, socialization, and escape. Some participants in community discussions for the Illinois assessment noted that older adults appear to prefer casino gambling and that they're often picked up by casino shuttle buses. There was a quote that seniors who lack mobility gladly participate because they view this as an outing, but this convenient arrangement is predatory. Other studies indicate that late life problem gambling may develop as vulnerable individuals gamble to escape anxiety and depression, consequent to deteriorating physical well-being and deteriorating social support, and can be seen as an avoidant coping approach. I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. Oh, and that's back to you, Natalia, for time.
Yeah, great. So when we look at treatment seeking by age, again, one finding that really stood out was the likelihood of Illinoisans that would not seek help for a gambling problem. So you can see on this graph the percentages across age groups. So overall, less than 5% said they would not seek help for a gambling problem for themselves or for someone else. Young adults, or those between the ages of 18 and 24, were the most likely at 9% to say that they would not seek help. And among young adults that would seek help, 54% said that they would seek help from a friend or family member. And so then shortly followed by some of the other age categories. And then 3.7% of Illinoisans 65 or above said that they would not seek help. So while seeking help from a friend or family member was still a popular source of support for a lot of different age groups, we also want to highlight that different approaches might work for different age groups. So for older adults, they were more likely to say that they would seek support from something like a peer support group, such as Gamblers Anonymous, and also encouragingly so more likely to say that they would seek out to a mental health professional. So really understanding these differences in the ways that these age groups would seek out treatment is important to think about what might be received better than other kind of approaches. So now that we've kind of covered some of those differences by age, we have our final poll question.
Okay. Let me get number 3 and launch it here. Okay, so which of the following statements is false? Is it A, lottery is the most popular form of gambling among older adults and youth? Or is it B, again, which of these statements are false? Youth with poor coping strategies might be a higher risk for problem gambling. Or is it C, older adults experiencing social isolation may be a higher risk for problem gambling? Or D, sports betting was most popular among older adults. Which one of those statements are false? We're nearing up to 60% here. Oh, good. Give you 5 more seconds here. We're at 81%. Okay. And I'm going to end the poll, share the results. The correct answer was D. Sports betting was most popular among older adults, which is false, right? So, yeah, I'll stop
Yeah.
sharing and let you guys open the conversation.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, as you can see, sports betting and fight betting was most popular among younger adults, so those between the ages of 18 and 44, which are shown in the green bars. So we're going to skip questions to make sure that we have some time at the end and just sort of summarize some of the big takeaways. So Hannah, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. And as we're wrapping up, feel free to put any questions that you have in the chat. So our sort of take home points for you all. First, summary across race ethnicity findings. So for Asian Illinoisans, we want to highlight that gaming and high stakes gambling may be perceived differently. And because of that, the shame and stigma in seeking treatment may be sort of confused and complicated based on what people are perceiving as what they're doing, being gambling or not. Among Black and African-American Illinoisans, this was the group that perceived gambling the most positively in terms of economics, being good for the economy, being good for socializing. And also due to sort of structural factors, structural racism may also view gambling as a way to achieve economic success. Among Hispanic and Latinx Illinoisans, again, they were the least likely to gamble, but if they do gamble, they appeared more likely to develop a gambling problem. 7.3% of Hispanic Illinoisans who were frequent gamblers had a gambling problem. Oh no, I'm sorry, 7.3% of Hispanic Illinoisans had a problem gambling. And finally, gambling is seen as harmful to families and stigma associated with those who may have a problem, we found in the Hispanic community. Back to you, Natalia.
Great. And so in terms of age, we really want to highlight that for older adults, there are some unique factors that might make some of them more vulnerable, including low income, comorbid health conditions, and social isolation. So really thinking about the anxiety and depression that emerge from these factors that people might use gambling to escape from. And so while existing data on youth indicates that few youth are gambling, some concerning growing trends in online gambling and the way that gambling is marketed might make youth gambling a bigger problem later down the road, especially among those that sort of lack good coping strategies or sensation seeking, or it might be more impulsive. But it's also important to think about the environment around these youth and sort of what are the opportunities that they have available to them to make sure that they're economically stable and socially supported. Are they getting bombarded by marketing, targeted marketing? So we really need to think about all of these subpopulations and take a step back to see how it's all connected. So each of the groups that we discussed are really nested in multiple environments at the family, community, and society level, and they all play a role in determining any one person's risk for developing a gambling problem. So we listed just a few of the findings from this first Illinois baseline assessment to highlight some of these demographics factors individually, but in reality, it's more like a complicated web when you think about the ways that people are at risk. So as we've highlighted throughout this presentation, there's really no one face for problem gambling, and we hope that you're able to take that away and really challenge the ways that that might present in a treatment setting. Additionally, as treatment providers or sort of others involved in supporting those with problem gambling, continuing to raise awareness and educate about the issue is crucial. You can't just ask somebody if they gamble because they might not answer that they gamble at all. Since in our study, we found that when we first asked Illinoisans if they gambled, 40.5% of those that reported not gambling later said they did gamble when presented with specific forms of gambling. So they might not think about like raffles or board games where you're betting as gambling. So it's important to ask those questions in different ways. So in the state of Illinois, we also identified that particular populations could benefit from continued outreach to ensure that providers reflect the community and resources are available to meet the culturally specific needs of these communities that are at higher risk. So the impact of gambling is really likely underestimated when we think about the countless affected others, including families and friends that are also sort of braving the brunt of financial, social, and emotional consequences that are associated with problem gambling more broadly. But they're also sort of the source that a lot of people seek when they do need help for a potential problem. And so like other forms of addiction, social support is really important in engaging those loved ones across that continuum of treatment and recovery is critical. So sort of consider this information that we presented in this webinar to be a first step. But we recognize people are complicated and they might not fit into these data boxes that we talked about. It's really about the layered experiences that people have and the multiple identities that can shape a person's risk for developing problem gambling. So here are some references that we can definitely make available if you're interested in some of the more research that we talked about. But besides that, we want to kind of open it up in the chat for any last comments, questions, discussion, and we have a link to the assessment in case you're interested in learning more.
Yes, we want to welcome any comments or questions that you guys have for Natalia or Dr. Carliner as we have them for the next just couple of minutes. Thank you for the great information. I mean, for how the landscape from what you got from your studies shows in Illinois, I think it's really important for just not the, because most of the folks here are clinicians I see on the call, but for prevention strategy, right? But it was really nicely done, and I appreciate the work. So yeah, with the sports gambling, the older adult population on the last poll question was very interesting. I see most of the folks that I get with sports betting are young males. My practice is a little bit biased because that's where I focus. But here in Massachusetts, I don't know how many I have though, but with sports gambling and with the technology and how that's tied into that, that's what I see. But that somewhat makes sense from what I'm seeing. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Well, the results was false. It was, so you're right. It is more in younger people.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. Because I started thinking about that too. But I love the piece too that you covered, Hannah, on the older adult population. I think it's really important because it's growing, and you guys position it as the really vulnerable populations as the young adult, and then the older adult population is something that we got to keep our eye on. So that was great. So you're getting a lot of thank yous and appreciations here in the chats.
Thank you, everyone. There was a question from Joy about what is a loot game. I'm going to pass that to Natalia.
Yeah. So this is something that might be more popular among those that engage in video gaming or sort of mobile gaming. Sometimes you can, for these pay-to-play games, you can buy a certain amount of like coins or sort of like virtual money in a game to get a random exclusive digital content of some sort. So sometimes this might be like costumes for a character or certain sort of like benefits that you can use in the game, either mobily or sort of in a video game. And so a lot of people don't think about this as being gambling, but it is like a transaction where you're assigning value to something and you're getting some kind of like random result. And so people can spend tons of money just trying to get the one very exclusive loot that they get in the game.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for catching that, Hannah. I saw that earlier. Yeah, and thank you for answering that, Natalia. Yeah, great job, everybody. You're getting a lot of thanks. And again, this is some wonderful information too. Hannah, I wasn't able to ask you this. Well, maybe I can ask you off. People are asking about the slides and if they're available. And I know this study, it took us a while to get this to the public, but maybe we can talk offline about that.
Yeah, we can make them available.
Okay, thank you very much. And CEUs will be available, folks. Be patient with me. I'm working with the state now to get some past webinar CEU certificates out. So I'm still waiting. I think there's a bit of a hold up there. So we're waiting on that. So again, I would like to thank Dr. Hannah Carliner and Natalia for the great work. This is really good stuff, again, especially from a prevention through a prevention lens, and that comes from a clinician. And yeah, we want to thank you guys for this great work in Illinois. And Natalia, listen, I owe you an apology. I misspoke. I didn't state your pronoun correctly in your bio, so you're they. So my apologies. I rushed through that, and I'm sorry. But thank you for the great talk today and the great information. And thank you for having those slides available. I think it's important we incorporate this maybe in the 30-hour core class, because we talk about race, ethnicity, and a lot of other things, but this is really good information for the state. So thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
Okay, cool. You guys all have a great day, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow with Dr. Stephanie Diaz-Morel speaking on screening for gaming disorder. Okay, guys, everybody have a great day. Thank you again, Hannah. Thank you, Natalia. See you. All right. Bye-bye.